All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to our webinar on creating inclusive programming and practice for LGBTQ youth. This is just our little slide here about the what to do with the webinar equipment itself. So just move any especially cell phones and things like that away from your computer if you're experiencing any feedback or anything like that. It improves the quality of the sound. And similarly recommend that we close all file sharing applications, your Pandora, your YouTube, if you could close those on your browser as well. And if you can't hear, it might be because of something that you just haven't checked or unchecked. However, there's a question box, and we do have somebody on staff to help you troubleshoot any audio issues that you might have. You're going to be on mute until the Q&A, and at that point we're going to both allow for hand raising for audio questions, or we will save questions at the end. So you can feel free to type questions into your question box, and we'll get to those at the end. And so that is all for now, and so we're ready to begin our presentation. I'm Chris Gowan, and I am the PI and Dissemination Manager here at Pathways to Positive Futures. And Christian, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Christian Rummel, and I am a doctoral student at Portland State doing my dissertation on mentoring for gay youth.
Great. So the next slide. So this is just a quick agenda. We're going to go very briefly over some definitions and then talk about why we should consider young people of different sexual orientations and gender orientations as separate populations by looking at some of the risk factors. We'll spend a little bit of time on protective factors because unfortunately there's not a lot of data out there. And then we'll focus mostly, most of our presentation really on those strategies for support and how to be an ally to these populations, and then provide you with some additional resources and a Q&A. And just a reminder that this presentation as well as the audio recording of this webinar will be available on the Pathways website. So for the definitions, we have divided it up into both sexual orientation and gender orientation. Sexual orientation really is about who a person is attracted to romantically, emotionally, and so that's where young people who may identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or other pansexual, for example, which is another word for young people who are attracted to people of all sexes and genders. And then there's also gender orientation, which is very different from sexual orientation also. Sometimes people are tempted to overlap them. Gender orientation is about feeling different from the biological sex that one is born with. So it's identifying as more masculine or feminine, and may be similar to or different from the biological sex. And so the two terms that are often used as that very umbrella term are transgender, which is the T in your LGBT acronym, and then another term that is often used is just gender nonconforming, which is a very broad umbrella term for young people who just might do things that are outside of the gender norms. And then sometimes young people themselves use the term genderqueer because to help them conceptualize a gender they might experience that's not really male or female in that binary, but it's more inclusive, or it's more it's less polarized. And then the Qs, queer and questioning, can be used to refer to either somebody of a different sexual orientation or gender orientation. The term queer is often seen by older generations and people who are outside of the LGBTQ community as potentially derogatory, but young people and other populations are reclaiming that word. And so when working with populations as an ally, sometimes if a young person identifies as queer, sometimes it's just simple asking them if it's okay if you use that word as well. If you feel like that's a word that may not be one that's applicable for you, and they usually will be able to tell you. And then I also like to always put 2 Qs in my acronym of inclusion, because I like to remind myself and others that there's always those young people out there who are questioning their sexual and or gender orientation, and so we don't always know who we're working with if we think to ourselves, well, I don't have people who I work with that are of different sexual orientations or gender orientations. Sometimes those young people don't know themselves, and it's really important to always keep that in your mind when you're working with young people. Next slide.
So it's also important to learn a little bit about the climate that a lot of LGBTQ youth grow up in. And these few definitions can kind of give you an overview of some of the phobias that are out there. And so there's homophobia, which is a range of negative attitudes that and feelings that may be internal or externally felt toward gay and lesbian individuals. Transphobia is the irrational fear of those who are gender diverse and or the inability to deal with gender ambiguity. And then heterosexism is kind of the institutionalized version of homophobia that basically gives legitimization to that prejudice. And you can see that sometimes, for example, in the marriage debate that's going on across the country now. That typically marriage could be institutionalized as just one man and one woman. It could also be something around employment laws that you could be fired for being gay or being different. And so those are really important terms just to kind of be aware of, because it really sets the climate for victimization, stress, and some of the negative social sanctions that are happening with a lot of our young people today.
And so why consider the LGBTQ youth as separate populations? What are some of the negative outcomes that impact these populations disproportionately? So unfortunately, the answer is almost all of the health disparities that we examine are disproportionately impacting LGBTQ youth. And so alcohol and substance uses, driving under the influence is also falls under that category. Tobacco use, depression and suicide ideation, which I think has been getting a lot of press, especially recently in light of some of the tragedies related to cyberbullying incidents that have become more prominent in the news. Violence and also dating violence, although there's a little bit of contradictory evidence for that latter, the dating violence piece, seem to be disproportionately affecting youth. And then potentially somewhat paradoxically, teen pregnancy. Those young people who identify as lesbian and gay are more likely to report being involved in a pregnancy, and also are disproportionately affected by STIs and HIV. And this is just a time to note that most of the data that we have really relate to young people of different sexual orientations. We have very little data on trans youth, and most of the data that has been gathered on trans youth are youth who are transgender, but also in the homeless population. And so therefore there's added complexities to their stories and lives that make their health issues even more pronounced.
So some of the studies, just a little bit more details about the figures that we were just overviewing. GLSEN has done a national climate survey every couple of years to really explore the experiences of gay lesbian youth in schools. And some of the more recent findings were that almost 75% of gay or lesbian students reported hearing derogatory terms on a very frequent or often basis. 40% were actually physically harassed in school. 53% were cyberbullied, so something that might have occurred online. There's also a study about increased risk of HIV that the CDC did. It's a study looking at 15 to 22-year-olds in 7 different cities across the country. And they found that in that age group, 14% of the respondents were HIV positive, 7% were Latino, the 14% were African American, and 55% actually didn't even make anyone aware of the fact that they were attracted to other men of the same sex. Another study that kind of came out was looking at drug and alcohol use. Garofalo and a few others looked at basically understanding that there may be an initial using of cocaine or alcohol and marijuana use or engagement in sexual behaviors that were a little bit higher in prevalence than some of the heterosexual young people in the study.
And then also there's a report that just came out, I think it was just last month, that the CDC did highlighting the health disparities of gay, lesbian, and bisexual and questioning youth. Again, there's no data with the CDC on transgender youth, but this was came out of the Youth Risk Behavioral Surveillance System, and approximately 8 states collected data on sexual orientation, and they used those states in some metropolitan areas to look at the data and found that, for example, and I just pulled this particular drug out, but similar rates or disproportionalities are available for the other substances, but that 3.5% of the youth who are identifying as heterosexual have said that they've ever used methamphetamines, and compare that to youth who identify as either gay or lesbian at 21.5%, bisexual 15%, and the not sure or questioning youth 13%. So you can see that we say that the rates are higher. Well, how much higher? They can be quite a bit higher, enough for us to say, my goodness, 1 in 5 young people who identify as gay and lesbian have tried methamphetamines. And then similarly, as I was stating earlier, with suicide ideation and suicidalities, this was just the young people who said yes to the question, have you tried to commit suicide in the past 12 months? And so 7% of the 6.5% of the heterosexual youth said yes, whereas 1/4 of the gay and lesbian youth and 28% of the bisexual youth answered yes to the fact that just even within the past 12 months they had actually attempted to end their lives. So next slide. And although the causes of all of these health disparities are very complex, we'll spend a little bit of time just looking at some of them. Caitlin Ryan and her colleagues have been involved in something called the Family Acceptance Project, which is conducted in the California Bay Area, which is sort of known to be a more liberal area, more open to young people of different sexual orientations and gender orientations. And even in the Bay Area, she found that 30% of lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth report being rejected by their families, in the case, and rejected in the sense of being kicked out of their homes or not welcome, or felt that they were forced to leave because they came out as something other than heterosexual. And the young people who reported these higher levels of family rejection were much more likely to have reported attempting suicide, reported higher levels of depression, more likely to use drugs, and more likely to engage in unprotected sex. And so you can see that even within LGBT youth, that the family rejection really is another point of where the health disparities may be. So when you're working with young people, you can see, ask them or talk to them about who they've come out to, and if they feel safe with their families, or if their families are a welcoming environment. Next slide, please.
So it's also, in light of all of these kind of risks that are noted through the research, it's also really important to point out that whenever there is support that's available to young people, that there is something called social interaction anxiety that may get in the way of them really maximizing or leveraging that support. And so for those of you working with young people in mentoring programs, or if you're in an educational setting, and this is just something that's really important to be aware of as well. And looking at social interaction anxiety, it's defined as the fear of initiating and maintaining social conversations and interactions with others. It's based on the fear of being judged, and often you can see that in kind of the climate studies in school settings, and then the experiences of getting kicked out of a home or having difficulty with parents or with peers, and so that this is something that's very present. And so whenever you're offering support, just know that sometimes it may be difficult for an LGBTQ young person to really maximize that support, because there is some anxiety that happens sometimes in social relationships. So just another kind of area to think about in the work that you're doing, and why this may be something that's adding to the different population of young people.
So looking at the different systems and looking at our sort of cheat sheet of who signed up here, we do know that there's people who are involved in a lot of these different settings: corrections, foster care, homelessness, mental health. And what little data there is shows that youth of different sexual orientations and gender orientations are overrepresented in these systems. And so if we go to the next slide, these are just some examples of, well, why is this? Why are these young people overrepresented? Well, young people who come out to their families potentially are more likely to be kicked out of their home. There's pretty strong data, nationally represented data coming out of both the U.S. and Canada, that shows that LGBT youth are more likely to be abused by their parents and their guardians. Sometimes parents and guardians don't know how to deal with them, so there's a petition to rescind custody, and so that might happen, and so some of those things result in a disproportionality of homelessness or being removed from the home and placed in foster care, which might be more likely to cause a young person to leave the foster care home if they are also not supported. Obviously, if they are found to be in a supportive environment, then they're less likely to run away. They might be sent home if the petition is denied, in which case that they're less likely to want to really stay there. And then sometimes then, as a result of being kicked out, they might commit a survival crime, stealing, being in a public place, sort of trespassing, engaging in survival sex and things like that. And so those committing the crimes might, then they'll get caught potentially and end up in the juvenile justice system. So that's just an example of where homophobia or transphobia can sort of translate into higher representation in corrections. And if we go to the next slide, we can sort of see a similar story where being kicked out of the home or being rejected by parents can cause a young person to maybe feel isolation, or being harassed by peers might sort of cause them to self-medicate, use substances to either fit in better with the crowd or to escape the harassment they're feeling. It also, their internalized homophobia may cause them to either express themselves through internalizing or externalizing behaviors, which would disproportionately make them more likely to enter the mental health system. So these are just some illustrations and paths, and I'm sure many of you have some stories of young people you've worked with on how these young people end up in our systems, whereas if there was just some acceptance or support, they wouldn't be working with you in the first place. And so just to add, we've been a little down for the first 20 minutes of this presentation, but wanted to at least acknowledge some of the protective factors. They're not well studied, but a few things that have been found. For example, the work of Sandra Bem at Cornell University has found that young people and older people, people of all ages, who express less rigid gender roles are more likely to be happier, be more flexible, be more satisfied with life. And so being highly masculine or highly feminine is actually not found to be all that beneficial to one's mental health, and that being somewhere more in that gender non-conforming area can, at least from a personality standpoint and strengths standpoint, actually be beneficial. And then interesting work from Lisa Diamond has found that young women who have been in both female-female and male-female relationships are less tolerant of dating violence in their heterosexual relationship. So if they've dated a woman and then they go date a male later and they experience some form of emotional or physical violence, they're more likely to either leave or stand up for themselves and not tolerate it. And so this does, though, I just want to say, contradicts the CDC findings that find that LGB young people are more likely to report being hit by a partner or hurt by a partner on purpose. So a little thing. Young people, because of the difficulties that they experience, can have increased resilience and then also increased empathy for other. If they are of different sexual and gender orientations, their acceptance of diversity and understanding can be increased. If there's the opportunity, the sense of community can be strong in a supportive environment. And GLSEN, which is the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, has found that schools that have gay-straight alliances are more likely to have young people who are supported, less likely to be harassed in the school setting. And the data that we presented earlier from Caitlin Ryan shows that supportive adults can also be protective factors in these young people having a greater sense of overall well-being.
And, you know, kind of building off of those protective factors, there's a series of strategies for support that we'll kind of talk through. I know Chris is going to highlight some of the policy level, the high-level support. And then I'll go through and share some insight from identity development and then looking specifically at how programs can create a safe space in their climates and then also move from maybe a less tolerant climate into something that's more supportive. So I'll give a series of kind of strategies around that in the tips for change.
So looking at what is causing some of these disparities, we definitely looked at that from the sort of more personal standpoint and the social standpoint of looking at homophobia and transphobia and heterosexism. But other things are just within the system itself. There might be biases that are sort of inherent in the system without us really necessarily being aware of them. And so there is, and I encourage everyone to look this up because I think it's really interesting and they have a great theoretical framework behind it, but it's the bias-free framework at biasfree.org, and they talk about the stability of a triangle. And at the top of that triangle is maintaining the status quo, which is the privilege that people who are gender conforming and identify as heterosexual can have those privileges and to some extent either consciously or unconsciously just sort of maintain that status quo of having that sort of power and because they're less discriminated against. And so what ends up happening is there's sort of then two sides to that. One is that in some cases young people, we fail to examine the differences that young people of different sexual orientations and gender orientations face in their lives. So for example, the higher likelihoods of being harassed and treated poorly by adults and peers. Failing to examine the difference of the policies that we might have in place in a residential treatment center that forces a young person to choose if they need to be in the male ward or the female ward, or in some cases, in many states where a system will choose for that young person where they're in. And these are some differences that exist and are real, but that we try to, in sort of light of treating everyone quote-unquote the same, we don't examine the differences that are really affecting these young people. And then on the flip side, is the double standard, where we might see differences and treat people differently where potentially we shouldn't be treating them differently. So maybe it's through our policies on relationships and who can be in a relationship or public displays of affection or something to that effect. Or another is just like what sort of posters or things can be hung up on walls. And so that might be a case where there's a double standard and we treat people differently when we shouldn't. So now next slide. Sorry about that. So we think about the policies that most organizations have on the flip side to reduce or prevent bias. Most of our organizations have non-discrimination clauses. Not all of them specifically mention sexual and gender orientation, but for sure they would mention gender. And so that's a place where you might look in your organization from a policy standpoint to say, what is in writing in my organization that can allow me to sort of stand up for these young people if I feel like there's not a lot of support within my staff. A lot of organizations also mandate that when they serve youth that they have to provide those young people with a safe place. And so that is a policy one can draw on for if a young person is feeling that they're being harassed or teased or isolated or even physically assaulted within a system, to sort of say, I can stand up for this young person. I need to stand up for this young person because it is my duty to provide them with a safe place. Another one is confidentiality, so that when and if a young person comes out to you, it's your duty to keep that as a confidential piece of information unless it's a threat to their safety for some reason that you need to share that with somebody else. But another way you can sort of support young people is to talk to them about what you can and cannot keep confidential. And under most circumstances, keeping a young person's sexual orientation and perhaps gender orientation can be something that you can keep private between the two of you. And so that might make a young person feel more secure about disclosing. And sometimes there's others. So for example, here in Oregon, the foster care system has a policy that says you have to support the healthy development of young people. And so looking at Caitlin Ryan's and other work, supporting a young person, supporting that person's sexual orientation or gender orientation as they perceive it, can be seen as providing that healthy development that is required by the law. So, but I do want to add that the needs of gender nonconforming youth may require more specific policies regarding intake procedures, housing, etc., bathroom usage, and things like that. And so it does become complicated, especially in organizations that have older buildings that are highly gender segregated. And so working with that young person to see what you can do within the resources that you have may be a challenge, but just trying to, and even working with the young person saying, this is new for me, or we have to figure out how to make the system work with the limitations that we have. So just to let you in on some of the greatness but limitations that is Oregon, I will use some of the examples too. So these are state laws and policies that we have here that are other examples of, on a policy level, of where you can see there could be support for different young people of different sexual and gender orientations. So the Oregon Equality Act here forbids the discrimination of people based on gender identity and sexual orientation. We have in the Oregon Safe Schools Act, and many states have their Safe Schools Acts, we have specifically mentioned sexual orientation, and actually the law is written as real or perceived sexual orientation and real or perceived gender identity are protected classes that that all teachers and young people must be sort of trained, do assemblies, and talk about when it comes to bullying, as those are things that those are topics that need to be specifically mentioned. And also, interestingly enough, Oregon's sexuality education policy, which was just adopted in 2009, specifically states that sexuality education here in Oregon must be inclusive of different sexual orientations and gender roles, which I believe were the only, or one of a few that has that in there. So these are just some examples of other policies that can be more inclusive of young people of different sexual and gender orientations.
So, another area that can offer support is around the idea of identity development. And so it's really important to understand that one sexual orientation may be a little bit more of a permanent feature to a person, but their identity, the way that they accept and share who they are as a sexual minority, is a little bit of a different process. And so that process of offering support for identity development can actually make a huge difference for a lot of the young people that we're working with. On the next slide, I can kind of give you a little bit of more insight into how that might work, and also particularly because of the age range for young people that we might be working with and what they might be experiencing as they're undergoing this identity development process. So, for example, for gay youth, they have reported on average having same-sex feelings at age 10 and beginning to self-label at age 15 with their first disclosure at age 17. Lesbian youth reported same-sex feelings at age 11, but began to self-label at age 16 and had their first disclosures to others around age 17. So again, a lot of the young people we might be working with may be going through this process of labeling and understanding who they are based on their sexual orientation. And so there's some kind of caveats around that if there's an incongruence or if there's tension that's happening between an individual's kind of place where they are in their process of accepting themselves and then also that struggle that may be happening as they're going through this, that can create a lot more psychological kind of tension and stress. And then the other side of it is that for young people that have kind of navigated through and have found support for accepting who they are, there really hasn't been much significant difference in self-concept or self-esteem from heterosexual youth. So this may be another area that offers support in terms of really looking at how offering opportunities to let young people go through this process, and kind of I'll talk a little bit more about what the process is on the next series of slides. So sexual minority identity development, this is one model that's out there about how a young person would go through those phases of becoming aware of being different, and then exploring that difference, and then ultimately kind of synthesizing their experience as a sexual minority as part of their identity. And that happens on both an individual level, so a young person may be kind of thinking all of these thoughts and going through it, or on a group level, and that would be based on their support that they might be getting from others that are similar, or kind of maybe some of the negative sanctions that may be happening based on interaction that they might be having in school or at home. And so I actually am not going to talk too much in depth around this model, but just know that it kind of offers a way for young people to go through and resolve the tension that may be happening between who they were born as, or and then who they ultimately become based on their acceptance of self. So I'll move on to the next slide, actually. Another strategy beyond that is to take a person-centered approach. And so, for example, if you're working with a young person, that it's always important to meet a young person where they are. And so to emphasize the notion of self-concept and believe in the client's ability to grow. And so kind of the idea behind this is not to push a young person to come out before they're ready, but really just to meet them where they are and kind of how they've labeled themselves, and kind of being aware that they may be going through these phases of sexual minority identity development, and that you should offer kind of developmental support for wherever they come into your program, and make sure that they have access to a safe space. And that's also why the program climate is so important, is that young people are facing stigma and negative social sanctions. They have stress. They're going through this identity development process that's very confusing and kind of a very long-term process as well. And that if you offer a safe space that provides opportunities for them to feel that they belong, that can help them along in terms of giving opportunities to have protective factors there and help them overcome some of those external risks because they feel supported in ways that they might not have. So a few strategies you can use with your program in terms of the program climate. Discuss your organizational policy on diversity and whether you have a non-discrimination policy for gay and lesbian folks that are volunteering with your program, or for confidentiality requirements for the young person if they've shared that information. And I know Chris just emphasized that before. Particularly for mentors, make sure that they've been trained in how to support a young person that's coming out, so that they're aware that the young person might be going through different phases of accepting their identity, and that it's really important to meet them from that client-centered approach from where they are. And that another key piece is to make sure that your mentors or your volunteers are aware of their own biases and attitudes as they come into the program. You know, they may not be best suited to work with a young person that's coming out because they have a very different experience. Or if there is somebody that's gone through this process, they may actually have a lot of great ideas and kind of suggestions and kind of be a good advocate and have empathy for a young person that's kind of going through this kind of experience. It's very unique, actually. So it's important to kind of look at the overall program climate from that perspective. Another piece is for a lot of you that are working with young people. Just participating in this webinar is kind of meeting the criteria of our first goal, is to raise your own awareness of issues, learn about some of the stress, the identity development processes, the policies that are out there, and also figure out what resources are available to young people that are in your community. Are there gay-straight alliances at the high school? Is there a safe community center for them to access? And building on that, having a resource list for your staff in case there is a young person that they brush up against that they, you know, want to offer support to. Make sure that there is a resource list. And that could also be for your mentors. If there's a handbook, you could have some sort of resource opportunities for your volunteers, and then for the young people themselves as they're entering into your program. Be careful with your language. It can be very harmful at times if you just assume that a young person is straight, because that can kind of add on to that heterosexism that we talked about at the beginning. And so just be very inclusive with your language. So let the young person know that they do belong in your program and that they're also valued, and that can make a big difference. Creating guidelines to protect young people, and that goes back to issues around confidentiality and making sure that there is something that's written out for your program around making sure that information doesn't get out if it's not, if it's something that's important to retain as in confidence. And then be attentive to visible materials. I know in programs that I've worked for in the past, I've had a safe zone poster, and I've just placed that next to my desk, and that can actually make a huge difference for a young person, just so that they can see that there are others that are out there that can be an advocate, and that they know that visual representation is just something that increases the climate and the feeling of safety that's out there. So a few tips around building an inclusive program. And, you know, a lot of people have talked to me about whether or not they're prepared to take on some of those climate changes that are out there. And there was a study done by, I believe it was GLSEN, back in 1999 that looked at independent schools. And I really liked it was a mixed method study. They looked at both, kind of did focus groups with some of the schools that had become really inclusive, and they really learned about what steps they took to become, you know, very welcoming and supportive for LGBTQ youth. And so what their recommendations were always start small. Just know that you can't make some of the changes overnight, that it's really important to kind of test the waters around what works, in your community. Just, again, take very small steps. And some of the ways you can do that is have discussions with some identified key allies in your program. There's a volunteer that you know of that is very supportive of this as an issue, a staff person, a community member, a board member. And in those discussions, you could use a film or other medium. A great tool that's been out there over the last year is Dan Savage's It Gets Better project, which it just shares stories of people that have come out and gone through this process of, making it through high school and surviving, or and just letting young people know that it does get better. And so that's on YouTube. You can easily access that. There's an organization here in San Francisco that's called GroundSpark, and they have a series of films that they offer to facilitate around issues, and that would include gender issues and sexual orientation issues, particularly for K through 12 populations. And so it's a really great organization. And then also just, take that litmus test of the comfort level and need in your agency and community whenever you're first just beginning the process. So if you're a little bit further along and you've kind of taken those steps, the next slide will kind of offer some insight into if you're ready and you've decided to commit to making some of those changes. And some of the recommendations are to raise awareness of others, so to kind of branch out a little bit, have maybe small group meetings with some of your stakeholders, to holding individual workshops with parents, and then also with maybe other teachers or some of your mentors or your volunteers, and using some of those tools that are out there, like It Gets Better or GroundSpark's movies. You could also invite a local advocacy coalition to come in if there's an agency that's in your area that offers support to LGBTQ youth. Have them come in and speak. I know in Portland, it was Bridge 13 was a great advocacy group that shared some of the different stories from young people, and they were out there leading the way and kind of helping to bridge some of those changes. And then really start studying the issue of inclusivity in depth by conducting a formal needs assessment in your program and in your community, and just making sure you can understand exactly where you are in terms of creating a safer climate. And then the last one is, if you're ready to be proactive and you're there, go ahead and set up a strategic planning committee. Get that focus group information to steer where you're going with the steps that you're going to take, and really tailor those program changes to identified needs. So the things that you found out during your needs assessment, really kind of target your changes to those specific things to your program, and then focus on your language on issues of equality and ensuring that all young people in your community are served. I think people respond to the word equality in ways that it's something that they want things to be the same for their child as it would be for another child in your program, and so, or a young person in your program. So that language was found to be really important in kind of making some of the differences. And so those are some of the steps that the study identified for schools, but I think it really could be applicable to mentoring programs or other advocacy groups that are out there. And so I just wanted to highlight that, because I think that can be an important piece of kind of giving you that roadmap for how to make some of the differences that you're hoping to achieve. And so that pretty much concludes our piece around building inclusive programs. We have some resources we're going to highlight next, and I know Chris is going to talk a little bit about some of the online resources, and then we'll look at some print materials and other organizations that are out there.
So taking the second piece first in our list of online resources, GLSEN we've mentioned quite a bit, and they provide a lot of statistics, and they also have a lot of how-to guides and curricula and things like that that I think are really useful. Although they are meant mostly for a school setting, I think a lot of it can be applied to other types of organizations serving youth. And then the third bullet, SAMHSA, through the National Center for Cultural Competency at Georgetown University, has done a lot of great documents on working with LGBT youth, and I just put this one down as an example of, I think this one's the one on working with families and inclusiveness there, but they really have a lot of powerful documents that can be really helpful, and they're brief, they're 2 to 4 pages, and can really help direct people in terms of either data to support the need to be stronger allies for these populations, and then also talk about what does work. The top one is a project that I'm the principal investigator on here in the Portland metro area, although we're hoping to expand it more statewide, on creating unbiased services and providing trainings for people within the foster care system and the juvenile justice system. And because these slides will be available on the Pathways website, you don't have to copy down this very unfriendly URL, but at that URL are a list of resources, including trainings that we have found that are free online, plus a training that we've developed that's more at that policy systems level. And you are free to use that training, free to read that training and look at things. If you have any questions, you can totally contact me about how we've used that training and how we hope to use it in the future. There's also just other online resources. So really that top one is sort of a portal to a bunch more resources that are available online. I also just wanted to mention briefly that we've talked about safe zone posters. And if you go to SMYRC, which is smyrc.org, they also have a resources page, but they have some PDFs of some safe zone posters that are free that you could print out on a color printer or a black and white printer and put up at your organization. So that's just a place that you could get a safe zone poster for pretty cheap. So next on the other resources.
So there's a few resources that are also mentoring specific. I know there was an organization called the Association of Mentoring Professionals that was out a few years back. And there's an article called Creating Inclusive Mentoring Programs for Sexual Minority Youth. And so that's something that's a print material that's out there. EMT in California also has something, and you can go to their website. I think it's emt.org or something similar to that. Mentoring gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender youth. And that also has a lot of information about definitions and specific strategies that mentors can use to offer support, especially for that identity development process. The National Mentoring Center, which is at Education Northwest in Portland, has a technical assistance packet mentoring sexual minority youths, and it has a lot of materials around training your volunteers around how to be advocates for gay and lesbian youth, and then also information about setting up a safe climate. Some of those materials were actually from the National Youth Advocacy Coalition, which is in D.C., which has a lot of great resources and materials as well. So you could look them up online and kind of leverage some of their resources that are out there. So those are some of the print and organizational resources that are available too.
Okay, so now we are open for the Q&A, and so either you can type your question into the question box and we can get to it that way, or feel free to raise your hand. That is going to be, that function is now going to be open, and that will allow you to actually ask a question. So if you're on the VoIP, then that's fine, and if not, if you're on phone and your hand is raised and we unmute you, don't forget to unmute your phone as well. So I have one question so far, which is, what are some opinion suggestions on how to place transgendered individuals in a correctional setting? And so the best practice right now is to ask the young person what what placement they would prefer, if they would feel more comfortable in the male or the female. Now, if that goes against your policy, that's going to be difficult because, as this person states, many states do sort of look at biological sex and place someone accordingly there. But again, working with things like your safe space policies and things like that and non-discrimination, sometimes you can advocate for that young person to be placed in the correctional setting with people whose gender they identify with most closely. And so that's what is considered the best practice at this point. On that unfriendly URL, we have a list of best practices, and the state that I believe has the most specific best practices related to trans youth in correctional settings is New York, and their policies are available online and go into as much of the detail to, like, who should do a pat down, how do you do a strip search, how do you deal with bathroom settings and things like that. And so for whatever reason, New York has dealt with this in the most detail. So I encourage you to look at New York's policies as well. So I'm seeing, all right, there is a question from Mary Perez. Mary, I'm going to unmute you. Mary, are you there?
Yes.
Great.
But I didn't have a question, I'm sorry.
Oh, you didn't? Okay, no problem. All right, I'll unmute you. I'm going to go through to Michael Huslav-Schmidt. Hi, do you have a question?
Hi, yeah, first of all, thank you. What a great webinar.
Thanks.
I also want just to put out for everyone, for Oregon, because you may have mentioned it, I couldn't hear you, but there are great resources for transgender youth with Transactive.
Transactive is amazing. Transactiveonline.org is a great place for people actually all over the country can really gain, I think, a lot from that resource.
So thank you for plugging them.
Any other questions or comments? Well, if there's no other questions or comments, we would just like to thank you all again and thank our funders who are Pathways to Positive Futures, SAMHSA and NIDR. And again, feel free to contact us if you have any questions that you want answered privately. I'm at Gowen, Gowen, at pdx.edu, and so if you have any questions about the trainings that I've been doing or any of the other resources or anything that you've seen online, feel free to ask me there. And then Christian, do you want to share your contact information?
Yeah, it's Christian, which is pretty easy, at Mentorist, mentorist.org.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and these slides and the webinar will be available on the Pathways to Positive Futures website, and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.